You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Home Field Apparel.
Welcome back to Crimson Cast. Galen Clavio joining you. It is Monday, June 30th. The year is half over? That seems hard to believe, but here we are, halfway through 2025 and getting ready for the 4th of July, for July writ large, and then eventually, of course, the start of the college football season, which is coming up sooner than we know it. And we wanted to do a check-in on IU football, so we brought Taylor Lehman from Bison back to round out the end of the half year, talk about what we've seen in recruiting overall as the pace has slowed down a little bit, and see where Indiana landed and compare this to some earlier eras and some of the things that we have talked about previously on the show. Taylor, good to see you, man. How you doing?
I'm good. You talking about like the year being half over. I turned 30 in August. And,
oh no.
You know, it's one of those years, Galen. Yeah, no, I can't believe that. That's nuts. I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah, it's nuts. This has really gone quickly this whole year. I feel like maybe it's a coaching search thing. Maybe it's just having football to look forward to, although that really should make the year feel like it's moving slower, not faster. But I tell you what has moved fast is the rate of recruiting for IU football, which we're going to talk about here in just a minute. That's really the main thrust of the podcast. So we'll do that and talk about the latest bite-sized Bison and got a couple other matters we'll chat about as well. But first, just a quick reminder, folks, we are brought to you by Home Field Apparel, the place to go for the finest in college fashions, the softest fabrics, the coolest designs. Halfway thereabouts through their summer series, they just released some Penn State hats. And they're sure to have a lot of other fun stuff coming up this summer in anticipation of fall, as they'll have a ton of new apparel coming out to add to the already extensive collections of things available on the Home Field Apparel website. You can use the code HOME23, HOME23, and get 15% off your first order. Go do that and follow them on socials. They do a great job, especially on Instagram and on TikTok and on Twitter, as they'll show you what they're doing. They've got great stories behind a lot of the different pieces that you'll find on the website. So head over to Home Field Apparel, proud sponsor of the Back Home Network. Also, just a reminder, we are on YouTube. Subscribe to Back Home Network. Set your alerts so that when we go live or when we post something new, you find out about it. We broke through the 7,700 barrier in terms of subscribers. We keep going up with that. We got some great new shows. They're going to be coming up this fall. Should have an announcement on those in about a week. And I think you folks will be excited by what we've got joining the network here over the course of the next couple of months, as it'll tide you over throughout the course of fall through football and basketball seasons as well. Also, just a reminder, folks, you can, of course, subscribe via Substack. It's free. You can support the podcast financially there if you would like to. But go to crimsoncast.substack.com. I will make one quick programming note. We did just switch over some hosting for the podcast, and there was a slight interruption on the Apple podcast links. So if you are subscribed on Apple and you haven't gotten the Prince Alexander Moody commitment podcast, which we did on Friday, just let me know. You can find us on Twitter at CrimsonCast. We want to make sure you folks are getting the podcasts that you signed up for. So I think everything's fixed now, but if for whatever reason it's not, please let us know. Anyway, let's go ahead and dive into the meat and potatoes portion of the podcast. Taylor, I wanted to call up, you and I have gone back and forth and talked about just how fundamentally different it feels right now with IU football. And there's been a bunch of different things that we've seen. There was something that got put up yesterday, which I was, one of the many things that I've seen where it's just kind of like, wow, what world are we living in? But Max Chadwick, who's a football analyst for Pro Football Focus, had a tweet where he listed schools with multiple top 10 players. And I'm actually going to share my screen real quick, just so folks that are viewing this at home can take a look. And you can see this. Schools with multiple top 10 players in my position rankings. Alabama had 9, no shock there. Penn State 7, Texas 6, Clemson 5, and then a cluster of teams tied for 5th with 4, or tied for 6th, I guess, with 4. And Indiana is one of them, alongside Auburn, Florida, Notre Dame, and Oregon. And if I looked at this correctly, I don't even know if that's a completely accurate representation, because when you go look at the rankings of these various Indiana Hoosiers, that I don't believe. I mean, they have D'Angelo Pons in the mix. I don't believe that he had Aiden Fisher amongst the mix, which seems like a little bit of an oversight. But it's amazing, just in general, for IU to be in that level of rarefied air in terms of the level of player and the recognition nationally. Normally, Indiana's got 1 player on that list, maybe. To have 4 and maybe to have an argument for more than that is quite something at this point, Taylor.
Yeah, I think it speaks volumes for the staff's ability to develop talent, because a lot of those guys are the JMU guys that came over to Indiana with this staff. And I think that we're going to look back on whatever Indiana football ends up becoming, and I think we're going to remember those particular guys that are on that list. It's like Mikhail Kamara, Elijah Surratt, D'Angelo Pons, and then obviously we're talking about Aiden Fisher. He's not on that list, but he could be. And those guys that really brought the culture with them, but also translated it to the field. I think you could talk about them all day and not give them enough credit. I think it's a big deal, and so, but then that shows. It also shows why Cignetti wanted to pay Derek Owings so much money to keep him from USC. So, yeah, I mean, it shows promise. There's a lot of stars, a lot of high end talent for 2025. I think with all the recruiting that they've been doing, and we're going to talk more about recruiting, is kind of on my mind. But who are the next guys that are like that? So it's exciting.
Yeah, it's one of those things where if you're going to take a glass half empty approach, which there's still a decent amount of the IU fan base for whom that's the normal operational mode, and I certainly can understand that perspective. Fair. But we went from, I can't believe they hired this coach from JMU who doesn't have any Power 5 experience as a head coach, to I can't believe he's bringing his entire staff with him. Like, those guys aren't going to know what they're supposed to do at this level, to I can't believe we're bringing in 15 plus transfers from James Madison. How are those guys ever going to compete at the Big Ten level? To now, I mean, there's no next element. It's like everything that has happened so far has been demonstrated. I guess it is what you just said, which is who steps up next. Like, how are we going to possibly replace these guys that most people didn't think could compete at this level in the first place? And this is where I just find the whole thing fascinating. It's where I really find the transfer portal fascinating as an experiment, as almost a thought experiment, but in action, where if you think about the pathways for, like, Elijah Surratt is probably the most fascinating of the pathways, because he started at a lower level than even James Madison, and he gets pulled up to James Madison, and then he comes along, and he clearly is a receiver that can compete at the highest levels of college football. It's not how we've been programmed to think about college football, especially from a talent perspective. Are you surprised, I guess, at how well that particular group, that just take the 4 that we talked about, Kamara, Pons, Surratt, and Fisher, have translated? Let's just start there. Like, are you surprised at how easily they were able to make that jump and sustain it throughout the course of a year?
Yeah, I am. I think Elijah Surratt saw his valleys. He saw his valleys in the season, but I'm mostly surprised at D'Angelo Pons. I thought, I was one of those doubters with his size and the way that he was able to kind of challenge some guys who were definitely bigger than him, and win a lot of one-on-one battles. I thought was really impressive. I thought Mikhail Kamara kind of saw his match against some of the more talented and bigger teams. So I'm interested to see how he reacts to that at his new position. And I'm curious to see Elijah Surratt put a full season together too. Not that he wasn't impressive this past season, but there were some times where he could have executed better. And yeah, I mean, it definitely wasn't perfect. It wasn't like their seasons at JMU, but it was really impressive. And kind of like what you were saying, Galen, like who replaces them? It's like who, like, let's see the staff develop at Indiana now.
Right.
Instead of just seeing them develop the JMU guys and bring them to the Big Ten, let's see the staff develop at Indiana for the individual players, but also let's see the coordinators and these systems respond to having that exposure to the Big Ten now. Like, how are they going to change to stay fresh and effective? I think there's a lot of different layers to that, where, coming from JMU is one thing, but, playing a full season in the Big Ten and then being as productive the next year again, like, can that happen?
Yeah, I mean, it's where I think what I guess in the back of my head I wouldn't have been surprised by last year was, okay, you start off strong. I think we talked about this even last year during the show. You start off strong, more film gets collected on you, your effectiveness becomes less and less. That really didn't happen with this group.
Yeah.
And that is really fascinating. I mean, if Elijah Surratt's effectiveness went down a little bit at the end of the year, it was largely because of what we now know to be Curtis Rourke's injury and injuries along the offensive line, cutting off the amount of time he had to do what he needed to do. But yeah, I mean, for those who are, saying, okay, well, now we need to see, the coaching staff develop at this level. The thing I'll say is, like, you could take a guy like CJ West, who was not a JMU player, and they clearly took him and developed him to a level where he was, a drafted player by a pretty good team. You're also looking at a situation at this level, and I think we're seeing it bear out in recruiting now, where this group's just got access to a higher caliber of talent. And I'm really fascinated to see how that manifests itself, especially if they're able to keep this staff, continually together for a little bit longer. I mean, I'm sure there's going to be some defections as time goes by, but it will be fascinating to see how that process goes, because, hypothetically, you should be able to go through the same developmental process that you've gone through with these players who were at JMU, who were not that highly regarded, in the big scheme of things, but with maybe a higher floor from a physicality perspective, or just an athleticism perspective. It does make me very excited to see what that process will look like moving forward. And I think if, for all of the different reasons why people are optimistic, and a lot of it is obviously great success in the transfer portal, what seems like getting the right guys, and the number of players returning from what was a really, really good team last year, I don't know that we've even scratched the surface of what this particular coaching staff can do developmentally at this level. And that really is exciting to think about.
Yeah, it is. And that was one of the more things that I think was objectively exciting. One of the most objectively exciting aspects of the hire itself was when Cignetti brought his staff with him. We saw what they did at JMU with the talent that they had there and competing against top 25 teams, like, really competitively. And, the idea that they would bring that system, and even, I mean, obviously the players, but, like, transplant that system with the access to the talent, and not only just the talent, but the skill sets and what they could do with that. Because I think what we're seeing now and through recruiting is that, especially along the defensive line, we're seeing that they are really piling up talent that is not, it's not necessarily, it doesn't fit like the cookie cutter idea of like what a defensive tackle is or what a defensive end is. It's like several different skill sets because they need to fit this particular role within Bryant Haynes' defense. And now Bryant Haynes has access to all of those skill sets. Like at JMU, you probably aren't accessing a bunch of different types of defensive linemen who can do the things that a defensive lineman that the system could do. CJ West is a great example of that. They got CJ West, they dropped the big bag, and they brought him from Kent State. And because they knew the role that he was going to serve in that defense, and they knew that they needed it, and they put Bryant Haynes put CJ West in a fantastic position to execute and do what he did. And of course, CJ West having the talent that he had made it that much easier. But the access to the different skills now, I think, is paired with what you were saying with the talent floor, is is something that is really exciting, because it's something that Mike Shanahan and Brian Haynes both operate on, is just a ton of versatility and a ton of rotation, whether that's receivers or running backs or defensive linemen or linebackers.
You've brought this up before. Zach Osterman's brought it up before on the show. I mean, you know, the things that really tend to separate at the very highest levels of college football are depth and obviously top end talent, but the depth to not have to drop so far down in terms of the talent that's available when that talent that's starting needs to come out for a breather. So you almost have to moneyball it a little bit. And I think you hit on a couple of things that this staff's already doing. When I say moneyball it, what I mean is, A, you got to look for some undervalued assets that you can work into positional roles that will work. And I think your comments on the defensive line are a great example of that, where are you going to get the absolute physical specimen types that an Ohio State or an Alabama or a USC is pulling in? No. I just think that fundamentally you're still a long way away from being able to regularly pull those players in, but you can still, as we saw last year, have a very effective defensive line by approaching it differently, both in terms of the talent intake, but also how you're playing them and how you're positioning. And that's where scheme can overcome some of those issues. Now, it probably has limits on how much it can overcome, and that's kind of the struggle with college football. It's why so few, I mean, you know, like what was our last real Cinderella champion in college football? Like, they don't really exist, and there's a reason for that. Like, it's not like basketball where you have a bad shooting night, you're done. 60 Minutes will generally tell you who your most talented positions are when they're playing against each other. But you don't need to be the most talented team. And I think for Indiana, like, you've got to look at this in stages. And the fact Indiana got to the college football playoff, the fact their odds are a little lower than I would have expected, but they're in the mix this year. And certainly they have a pathway to win their way into the college football playoff again. And I wouldn't bet against them at this point. But it does require being at that level or close to it long enough to make that next level, that next echelon of talent say, that's where I want to go. It's also where, again, you have to rely on your staff knowing what they're doing in terms of who they're going out and getting and when they're getting them and how they're going to try to develop them. And especially, and before we get to the big recruiting piece that we wanted to talk about here, we don't really know what awaits us moving forward. The transfer portal is probably not going to work in the future the way that the transfer portal is working now, where it's essentially unrestricted free agency. That's something that the universities are trying to lock down. It's something that they're trying to arrive at through a couple of different means, one of them being this revenue sharing approach. They're really trying to limit the amount of money that's out there. And I mean, will they ever completely eliminate that? No. But it might mean you really do have to lean on your recruiting to bring in the types of players and develop those players. And that's where this staff, I think, has shown, and that's why I think it's so exciting to have Cignetti and this staff here. They showed at JMU that they could develop people up to that level. And up to this point, it seems like they can develop people up to the Big Ten level and beyond. And that is a nice combination to have, especially when you compare it to some other staffs, even in the conference.
In the SEC. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's the thing. I mean, it's funny, the number of teams that get ridiculous numbers or amounts of talent that don't really do a ton with them in the SEC. It's one of the things that doesn't get talked about that much, but it is a constant issue if you look at certain programs over and over again.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Some of the I would say the Big Ten is probably better writ large at developing talent than the SEC. Yeah, and it's just a talent gap, or it has been a talent gap, and now I think a lot of that's closing as we're seeing. But yeah, no, you're right, Galen, and it'll be interesting to see how they kind of. That's the cool thing about Cignetti too, is that he is on the forefront of these changes. He's always trying to figure out how to leverage some sort of advantage within all these changes. Like, he's seeking to understand them and where his program fits within that, and how he can best strategize within that context. And I think that's something that's been really obvious since he's been here, since he's been talking about the rev share stuff. And I think that is something that has been a real breath of fresh air for Indiana fans, I would say. And I think as long as Cignetti is the head coach at Indiana, wading into these waters is a little bit more comfortable than it might be with, somebody else.
So let's talk about that aspect of things. This was really kind of the genesis of us wanting to pod, or me wanting to pod on this, was you sent me some, we've been messaging back and forth, and you sent me something about how big this incoming class is. And I think it's really fascinating because this is not normal for IU. And for a lot of you who are brand new or relatively new to IU football fandom, this may be news to you. IU has almost always, at least as long as we've known IU, they have waited until a lot later in the recruiting cycle to pull in guys who would commit. And that's just not what's happening right now. I'm going to call up a chart that was in Bite-Sized Bison, which you should all be subscribing to, by the way. Go to bitesizedbison.substack.com. If you love IU football, or if you're interested in IU football, this is the place to be to read about it. But this is a chart that you cooked up. Commitment rates since the December signing period during the Allen era and during the Cignetti era. So basically, it's laid out in terms of if you go past that December signing period and then look at what happens in the following cycle. The cycle reopens in late April, early May? Is that when it first opens back up again?
What do you mean, Galen? I'm sorry.
for the classes that are the new class that's coming in, you get the December signing period, you're done with everything. And then you got the next year's cycle. So what we're talking about essentially
is about March.
Yeah. Yep. So March is when it officially opens. And if you go back and look at this chart, you can see that by June 3rd, the average number of commits across all of rivals, if I'm reading this correctly, was about 4.3. Tom Allen's IU.
Oh, sorry, Galen. That's Indiana. That's
Indiana
during that period. Yep,
okay. So then if you look at Tom Allen specifically, it drops to 3.1 average recruits per cycle prior to June 4th, basically. By July 1st, that number under Allen was at about 7.6. And then the bulk of the recruiting classes, which generally were only about 19 or 20 on average during Allen's era, would come after July 1st. What you're seeing now, for Cignetti, 8 recruits signed on average by June 3rd, and then 18 by July 1st. So more than double, almost halfway between double and triple before July 1st, or by July 1st, I guess. And then expecting maybe 4 or 5 more recruits coming up afterwards. That's a huge jump. And it's something where you're used to seeing that kind of recruiting early commits, early verbals coming from the big programs. And if you're on Twitter or whatever, you're seeing, USC is making a bunch of signings during this period. Michigan's making a bunch of signings. Ohio State's making a bunch of signings. Indiana doesn't normally make signings during this period. And it's often kind of felt like IU was left to scramble for whatever was left in the recruiting pool after everybody else ate at the table. So I guess what I'm curious about is why? What's the genesis of IU suddenly being in the game, getting guys to commit after officials happening in the summer, which has happened on multiple occasions here throughout the course of this cycle? Other than just the staff is incredibly competent and really knows what they're doing. What's the explanation, in your opinion, for why Indiana is suddenly in the mix like this?
Yeah, I want to explain the calendar real fast, Galen, and why this is significant. Because
I did a bad job of that, by the way. Sorry, folks. So
no, I actually realized I should have labeled that chart better. That's on me. We're currently in the summer dead period, and that lasts all the way until the season begins, and there could be no visits, and it's all over the phone. Some crazy stuff happens. I wrote about this in the last BSB about Bijan Robinson suddenly flipping from Ohio State to Texas when I was covering Ohio State. That was crazy. And that all happened during the dead period because all these things happen really covertly in a way that doesn't necessarily happen in June. And so, in June, they're making all these official visits. Every weekend is an official visit for these recruits. And then a lot of times, and for most of them, they end up committing after whatever official visit they like the most, or maybe even at the beginning of the dead period, they'll commit, but they will have notified the teams. You want to have your class put together before this dead period. Not entirely, of course, because you're still gunning for some of these like high talents, and they usually go into the dead period. They have a lot of people who are trying to leverage things, or they're leveraging their talent to get, higher NIL deals and things along those lines. They have a lot of programs going after them. We see this with Indiana too. They're involved in some with some higher end recruits. And so it's really important, like you were laying out, Galen, because the sorry, there are some sirens going by. But
Taylor's podcast content is too hot to handle. They've actually called in authorities on this. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I need to wave them off or something. But yeah, so like you were saying, Galen, they'll be working in this 2026 class. They were working this class back in June 2020. What would that be, 2024 already? And so a year before they were set to commit, they had a lot of these really talented guys on campus, and a lot of them aren't even the ones that ended up committing, but having them on campus, that helped. You really raise your profile when you have certain guys on campus. They had a top 10 or the number 1 defensive end in the 2027 class on campus this summer. That's a good example. And the Juju Lewis, last summer, that was a great example as well. So they have all these really talented guys on campus. They start working their connections back the summer before they even start committing. And so what you'll see is then, like you were saying earlier, Galen, around spring camp, around like March, some guys will start committing, and sometimes even before that. But that period, that spring period is if you can get a lot of commitments, then that means your program is healthy and it's attractive. And so that's what we're seeing a lot from Indiana. And you can be proactive about it because they're recruiting these prospects for years, and they're scouting them, and you're saying I want this particular kid in this particular role. And so if you can present that to them and offer enough as a program, then they will commit. And I know I'm explaining some very basic stuff here, but this is why it's so important to have these commitments before July, because like you were saying, Galen, you might miss out. And then after that, you're just kind of left with whatever leftovers the programs decided that they didn't want for the price and the evaluation. And so you're just left with them. And so why this is different is I think part of it is obviously the 2024 success, but it's not all of that, because last year it was very similar, right, and they had 17 commitments at this point. And so, which I didn't even realize at the time. And so they're working a lot faster, just in general. This is just a strategy. It was before their success at IU. Obviously, they were leaning on their success at JMU, but I don't think all these prospects realized the JMU staff went to IU. They just knew that they were visiting IU, and these coaches were energetic and they were knowledgeable and they had experience that they could lean on. And I think that's the big part of it. They're really good at messaging. They have support staff that are really good at marketing the program. And I mean, also there's just institutional investment, and we're just talking about two different programs here, from Tom Allen's day to Curt Cignetti's day. And in my Bison today, there were definitely some critiques of Tom Allen's staff in terms of like recruiting and responding to the changing college football landscape. But at the same time, it's not all on Tom Allen and his staff. They were handcuffed, and so I know I threw a lot of things out there, but it's there are a lot of connected pieces. It's a big network, and right now they're just kind of trying to add to the class at this point, which I think they'll add a handful more guys. But it is really interesting to see. I'm really excited for Indiana fans to experience this with their program, because it makes the football program more exciting when you are competently putting together your class and you're competing with, Ohio State and Ole Miss and some of these other programs. So yeah, they must really have liked my takes there, Galen, because they just
the Ohio State staff is calling Taylor. Look, and that's the thing. I mean, because it wasn't just limited to the Allen era. Indiana has felt resource poor, has not felt like a place where college, aspirant players or players that felt like they had like a really high ceiling wanted to go. That doesn't mean Indiana hasn't had good players. It doesn't mean Indiana hasn't been in situations where, they've had success with getting recruits, but it does kind of put Indiana into a different category in terms of being able to have a class this fully formed again and to be able to roll forward knowing they can seek out the types of players that they really want with a nice, stable group of people. And, even the rankings, I mean, we've talked about this quite a bit. I mean, right now, with the one decommit that happened and the new commit that IU pulled in, 19 recruits, 3 4-stars, 14 3-stars, 29th according to, I think, On3, which is right in the midst of a bunch of Big Ten schools. Like, Minnesota's 23rd, Washington's 26th, Rutgers is 28th, but that's largely, but I mean, just those, well, not Washington, but Minnesota, Kansas, Rutgers, I mean, they're kind of volume dealers at this point, which kind of inflates your rankings because it's really about the number of players you sign. But Indiana's in that conversation for a top 25 class, if they sign the right players down the stretch here. And that builds on things after a while, especially if you've got continuity among the coaching staff and you look at all these relationships they're building. You look at the mix that they're in for a lot of these recruits, and it just feels like this is a pattern that can replicate. And it feels like the whole calendar gets moved back a little bit to where, now you're still working on recruiting, but you're working on next year's class as much as anything else, rather than having to scramble around as we've seen IU have to do over the course of the Allen era and even in the Wilson era, and have to scramble around to complete the class that you need for the upcoming year, which is a really big difference.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I just saw, a couple weeks ago, Ohio State got their first 2028 commitment.
Yeah.
I'm like, they're obviously not every program is working at that level. That's definitely an Ohio State thing. But yeah, I mean, that's just, you're right. You're there. Obviously they're trying to finish off this class, but their attention obviously is going to the season, of course, but it's starting to turn towards 2027 now. And, you've made your pitches to these guys. And if there's talent out there that's still available, and is interested in Indiana, they're going to approach it. But they're starting to move on to 2027 in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I mean,
so I'm happy the Indiana fans get to experience this. It is really fun. This is why I love recruiting so much.
Yeah, no, it's been a really fun summer, and now you get to move on to this next cycle, which is going to be all about fall camp and getting ready for the season. And you figure when this podcast drops, unless you're listening late Friday or late Monday night, by the time this drops, we're going to be under 2 months away from the first game. And that is really exciting stuff, and I'm really excited that we've had. I think last year's recruiting cycle, it was hard to know exactly what you were getting in the midst of all of it because no one knew what you were getting in Curt Cignetti quite yet at that point. It's funny. I was going back and I was on my walk this morning, and I was listening to a podcast from last summer, and it was just. It just randomly popped up as I was going through and looking. I was like, I wonder what that sounded like. And there's optimism, but I mean, it just feels like a completely different landscape from what was going on at that stage of things. And so if this is the new normal, like, man, sign me up for it. Seriously, this is great.
Yeah. I think, I agree. Galen. It is different than last year too. I think it'll be interesting to see. One thing I'm keeping my eye on is, they're really accumulating a lot of talent. And I wrote about this in the BSB too. They're accumulating a lot of talent at the high school ranks, which is going to make, we've talked about this before about how there's only 6 scholarships in the sophomore class right now. And so there's kind of like a chasm in between what they're trying to do, which is they're using the transfer portal to put these teams together. And then they're trying to bring in a lot of talent on the back end to develop it and smooth that into what will be the 2026 and 2027 rosters. I think it's going to make 2026 a really interesting time for Indiana because I think they're only going to have so many scholarships to deal with. And so I'm really curious to see what that looks like. I started putting together a 2026 scholarship chart with some guesses about how the season might go with scholarships. And it'll be interesting. It'll be a different looking team that they're gonna have to lean on some younger guys. And yeah. So anyway, I think I'm curious to see how they handle some of the increased talent that is looking in their direction compared to what they brought in when they first came to Bloomington. And does that develop enough to the point where you feel comfortable, or do you maybe suggest that they go elsewhere and you can use that scholarship in the transfer portal, or you can use it on someone who is interested in the program who might have a higher ceiling? I don't know. It'll be that's the next step for me. Is I'm like 4 steps ahead, but yeah.
Well, I do think it's interesting because, from the standpoint of what happens with those scholarships, and as you mentioned, like the lack of sophomores just in general, which, it's not even like a lack of sophomores. It's that, I mean, they're almost all on defense. It's like of the six, it's, one defensive lineman and 2 edge players and a linebacker, and then a wide receiver who hasn't played that much, and Nicholas Radicic. I mean, that's it. Now, I will say, if you look at the right now, the freshman and sophomore classes add up to 52 of the 80 players that are on scholarship. I would say I'm anticipating that maybe they're planning on filling out that 26 group that's where the transfers come in. And this idea that, that this year's freshman class, when they get here next year, that the incoming freshman class this year, the ones that are currently on campus, plus the guys that were added in from last year, like they're going to take some seasoning. You're going to like those as like guys who can get some minutes now, but they don't necessarily, you can go get players that come in above them if you have the money to spend. Use those guys as bridge years. And if you can pull in 6 or 7 players within that mix, well, now you got a class of 13, you've got a little more flexibility to deal with. And you figure you've got 26 players who could potentially use up their eligibility, I think, this year, between the last remaining COVID players and the players that are technically seniors.
Yep.
And then, so that you've got some room there to spread some things out, because even with all of those players, you're at 80 scholarships right now. So there is still some room to play with it. And maybe I don't know, maybe the strategy is, it doesn't make any sense to add to a sophomore class that would probably be behind the junior and senior classes anyway, and spending time and resources trying to develop those players coming in from outside that early would likely lead to them transferring. So then you've wasted your time and development on those players, and you've also not effectively developed the players that you did bring in those 2 freshman classes. That's probably how I would have strategized that on their part. Now, it is reliant on the idea that the transfer portal is still going to be open, that they can still go get people in that sophomore class. But they did kind of get caught having to part ways with several of those players that would have been in the sophomore class, on top of what I don't believe was a particularly large class to begin with.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Because, what Curt Cignetti said, that he walked into was a roster crisis, and he was right, because they had been leaning on the roster. They've been leaning on the transfer portal for so long at the end of the Tom Allen era, that there wasn't a ton of like good talent from the high school ranks. And obviously we saw, the staff let them go. And so that's where you're talking about that 6 scholarship class that includes like Elijah Hardy, Mario Landino, Daniel Ndukwe, Andrew DePay, Charlie Becker, and Nico Radicic. That's those guys are significant. Yeah. And so we understand that to be true. And so, the staff, and a lot of them are brought in by the staff. It's interesting. I think they can add to that class with the transfer portal for sure. I'm curious to see how that pans out, because there aren't a ton of juniors that end up coming through the portal. It's mostly just seniors. And so that class is just going to be interesting, I think, all the way until it graduates. But that's usually how it goes with the program's final recruiting class between coach.
Yeah. There's normally if you had a coaching change, you've got your explanation as to why you needed a coaching change in those recruiting classes. Before I let you go, I mean, last time we talked about IU football recruiting was May 23rd, and obviously we've had some recruits since then. A couple I just wanted to ask your opinion on in terms of where they fit within the big scheme of things and what kind of pull in. We talked a little bit about Parker Elmore before, I think on the live show that we did, so we don't need to touch on him. But there was a lot of press around the decommitted quarterback from Iowa, Cash Herrera, the quarterback out of San Diego, then turning around and committing to IU. Now, that was on the heels of a guy that IU was after, likely committing, or I think maybe he did commit to Ohio State, or is going to. But your opinion on Herrera coming in as the quarterback for that 26 class?
Yeah, he's somebody who's started to come on pretty strong towards the end of his recruitment. I think that probably contributed to his decommitment as well. He was starting to get a lot of attention. I think Indiana likes him. I think there's also he's number 48 quarterback in the class, which there were some folks who were a little confused by that because they were just recruiting 5-star last year. And so, with quarterbacks and recruiting, so much of it is timing and what you already have in your room. And I think bringing in Alberto Mendoza and Tyler Cherry in the same class kind of threw some things off. You don't see that very often. So whoever came in last year, it was Jacob Bell, but whoever was coming in was walking into a situation where they were behind two very talented quarterbacks. They might only get a year to play if they get any. And then this one here, that's still kind of the same situation. And, next year, I'm sure they're probably going to bring in a much more impressive high school quarterback. But I mean, I think Cash Herrera I think he's good. I think there's talent there. I think that's somebody you could develop. But I think, with Luke Fahey, I think he was interested in Ohio State. Ohio State's a good example. They're a good example of the same thing because they have two very young quarterbacks who are competing for the starting job. And the idea that you're going to get somebody to commit to sit behind them for 3 years or, have to compete with them for the starting role where they may not have to elsewhere is interesting. And I thought, a quarterback room is really interesting, Gail. And I pointed this out on BSB where, the 2023 quarterback room is spread out outside of Indiana, but it's still playing. It's really interesting because Taven Jackson is playing elsewhere. Brendan Sorsby is playing elsewhere. Dexter Williams is playing at Kennesaw State. We know that because Indiana's playing him. And then Brock Lowry is at Western Michigan. And so all four of those guys are still playing. They still have eligibility, but it's not with Indiana, which that was just in 2023, 2 seasons ago. Yeah. And so the quarterback room can turn over extremely quickly. So, the recruiting quarterbacks is good because you want to develop them. But at the same time, I think a lot of the quarterback talent acquired, especially at the tier for Indiana, is most likely going to be from the portal, especially with what this staff has been able to do. But also, I don't think we can talk about the quarterback recruiting in this class without mentioning that they lost Tino Sunseri. He's shown that in his time at UCLA already that he is incredibly good and he's incredibly connected, tapped into the quarterback network nationwide. And I think that was a huge loss for the staff. And also he's the guy doing your quarterback recruiting for you. And he just left, and you replaced him with Chandler Whitmer, who's very promising and could be a great coach, like on field, but he hasn't really ever been a primary quarterback's coach, and this is his first time doing that. And, you want to get a top 20 quarterback in the class, that's not necessarily promising for a kid to hear, especially when it's Indiana. So
right.
There's a lot of factors that went into that. And so, but I think Cash Herrera, for the situation that they were in and, the possibilities of what they could bring in, I think he's good. He could be developed.
Yeah. After we did that last podcast and we talked so much about how geographically clustered around the Midwest the recruiting had been, they go south with several of these commitments. They flip Kevontae Hugan from Louisville, and of course he's originally from Florida. They pull in Jamar Owens from Douglasville, Georgia, who had a pretty impressive offer list, a 3-star safety. They also pulled in Laurent Duz, another safety, who, I mean, I don't know, South is not necessarily exactly accurate on that, but not local, I guess, shall we say. So some different facets being shown off by this staff in terms of where they're going to go out and get talent. I mean, what stuck out to you out of all of those?
Yeah, I thought that was interesting, Galen. I thought that, yeah, I know they have some connections in Georgia, for sure, and so that the Georgia commitment wasn't too surprising. But the ones from Florida, that was promising to see, because I know that's kind of where, and we Indiana fans understand that that's where Tom Allen pulled a lot of his foundational talent from, was Florida. And I think at one point they had even had different sections of Florida. They pretty much had it mapped out and dispersed amongst their staff that was their part of Florida, and they almost attacked Florida like you would attack like a home region. And so this staff hasn't really hit Florida a whole lot. They've mostly focused on the DMV and then the surrounding area, like we had talked about. But yeah, I mean, I think it's encouraging, especially pulling a talent like Kevontae Hugan from Louisville and Mark Hagan. I think that's a big deal. He's a top 500 kid, and I think I think it's interesting. I'm curious to see how much the South really plays into their recruiting efforts in the future, because they have focused so much on local connections, but that wasn't going to last forever, because they're looking to make the local connections, but you also have to expand outside of that, which I think that they're looking to do.
Should be fascinating as we see what happens now. Just for everybody's calendar notifications, when does recruiting open back up? Like when does the dead period end?
September. So like September 1st. It goes until the last day of August, and really it basically a good way to think about it is like whenever the season starts. So even within the dead period, if a team's first week is within the dead period, they open up like a 48 or 24-hour window around the game so that you can host recruits. So it's pretty much whenever the season starts, and then the dead period will end, and it'll be a quiet period again, a lot like what June was. So recruits can come visit at games, and then also there's like contact periods in there too, where coaches can go to high school games as well.
Well, it's a fascinating process, and certainly one I think IU fans are still learning all of the ins and outs of in terms of this time period. But another successful summer recruiting cycle / spring for IU under Curt Cignetti, and we'll see what they're able to pull off in the fall. Taylor, as always, a pleasure, and good luck with everything here moving forward. We'll have you back on here shortly, and keep an eye on what's going on with IU football.
Yeah, thanks. I'm happy to report the authorities did not come and handcuff me because I was putting out these recruiting secrets or anything.
It's a dangerous business, podcasting about IU football, but those of us, we got like an underground thing going here. It's nice. Taylor Lehman from Bite Size Bison. Go to bitesizebison.substack.com or follow him at bytaylorl on Twitter. You will not regret it if you like IU football. For Taylor, I am Galen Clavio. This is Crimson Cast on the Back Home Network. We'll be back with more podcast goodness coming up a little bit later on this week, including some surprises. So tune in, subscribe. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. Stay never daunted. See you on the flip side. So long, everybody.